At 1:48 in the morning on Friday the 13th of November, 1942, a Japanese battleship's searchlight snapped on in the pitch-black waters off Guadalcanal and illuminated an American cruiser at a range of 4,500 yards, closer than some football stadiums are long. On the bridge of that cruiser, an officer turned to his admiral and said the only words that made any sense in that moment: "But this is suicide." Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callaghan did not disagree. He did not have time to disagree. He said, "Yes, I know, but we've got to do it." Then he gave the order to open fire. What happened in the next 40 minutes has never been fully replicated in the history of naval warfare, before or since. 13 American cruisers and destroyers, most of them without a coherent battle plan, collided head-on in total darkness with 14 Japanese warships, including 2 battleships built to level an entire airfield. There was no time to maneuver. There was no time for range finding. Ships fired on enemies passing so close that some crews could hear voices shouting in Japanese across the water. This was not a naval battle in any conventional sense. This was 2 fleets fighting each other in the dark with their bare hands. This is the story of the night that broke Japan's last real chance to take back Guadalcanal, and the American admiral who knew he was leading his men into a slaughter and did it anyway because the alternative was worse. By November of 1942, the fight for Guadalcanal had already ground on for 3 brutal months, and both sides understood exactly what the coming days would decide. The island's only prize worth dying for was a single dirt airstrip the Marines called Henderson Field. The one asset that let American aircraft contest the surrounding sea and sky, and the one asset Japan needed to destroy or seize if it was ever going to land enough troops to retake the island for good. Japanese command staff had assembled what amounted to their most serious attempt yet. Vice Admiral Hiroki Abe commanded a bombardment force built around 2 fast battleships, the Hiei and the Kirishima, each carrying 8 14-inch guns, escorted by a light cruiser and 11 destroyers. Their mission was brutally direct: sail into the waters off Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, unleash a sustained bombardment using special fragmentation shells designed specifically to shred an airfield and everything on it, and silence Henderson Field long enough for a slow convoy of Japanese transport ships carrying more than 10,000 troops to land unopposed and finish what 3 months of grinding jungle combat had failed to accomplish. Standing in their way was a scratch American force that had, in the most literal sense, never trained together as a unit. Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan commanded 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, hastily assembled from ships still recovering from earlier engagements, tasked with intercepting a battleship bombardment force with nothing heavier than 8-inch guns. The mathematics of the coming fight were almost cruelly one-sided. A single American cruiser's full broadside weighed a little over 2,000 pounds of shells. A single Japanese battleship's broadside, by comparison, weighed nearly 12,000 pounds. Callaghan was not simply outgunned. He was being asked to stand between 2 of the most powerful warships in the Pacific and the airfield that the entire Guadalcanal campaign depended on, with roughly 1/6 the firepower his opponent carried, and no realistic path to reinforcement before the shooting started. There was also no time to prepare a coherent plan, and almost no margin for the kind of caution that naval doctrine would normally demand. Admiral William Halsey's more powerful battleship force, Task Force 64 under Rear Admiral Willis Lee, was still steaming south, days away from the waters off Guadalcanal, unable to arrive before Abe's bombardment force made its run. Every American commander involved in the planning that week understood the same brutal truth. If Callaghan's cruisers and destroyers did not stand between Abe's battleships and Henderson Field that night, nothing else would. There was no second line of defense. There was no fallback position. The Marines dug into the perimeter around the airfield, the pilots sleeping beside their aircraft on the runway itself, the entire strategic logic of the Guadalcanal campaign. All of it depended on a task force that had been thrown together days earlier, riding into a fight that the numbers said it should not survive. A Japanese staff appreciation prepared just weeks earlier had described the stakes in almost identical terms from the other direction, calling the recapture of Guadalcanal and the naval battle tied to it the fork in the road that would decide victory or defeat for the entire Pacific campaign. Both sides, independently, had reached the same conclusion about what this single night was actually worth. That is what made the coming battle so much more than a tactical skirmish over an airstrip. It was, in the eyes of the men who planned it and the men who would fight it, one of the hinge points of the entire war in the Pacific. There was no secret weapon waiting to even the odds for Callaghan's task force that night. What there was instead was a decision, one made in the confusion of total darkness that would end up shaping the entire engagement more than any single gun or torpedo. Callaghan's force had already taken punishment before the main battle even began. On the 12th of November, a damaged Japanese aircraft, shot down during an attack on the American transports, crashed directly into his flagship San Francisco's after-fire control station, killing or wounding more than 50 men in a single instant. With his own ship's superstructure wrecked and burning, Callaghan spent the rest of that day preparing the task force for a battle everyone around him understood was almost certainly a losing proposition. That night, steaming through Ironbottom Sound in a hastily arranged single column, the American force made a critical navigational choice. Several of Callaghan's ships, including the light cruiser Helena, carried the newest SG-band surface search radar, a genuine technological advantage that, properly used, could have given the Americans a decisive edge in total darkness. But Callaghan placed his flagship without that radar at the head of the column rather than one of the radar-equipped cruisers, and issued no detailed battle plan to his commanders beforehand. It was by any conventional standard of naval doctrine a mistake. And then it produced something almost nobody could have planned for. Because Callaghan's column, moving without the tactical clarity radar could have provided, drove directly into the heart of the Japanese formation rather than intercepting it from a safe standoff range. At 1:24 a.m., far too close to alter course in any meaningful way, Callaghan realized his ships had sailed straight through AV screening destroyers and were now steaming directly into the center of the Japanese battle line itself. What should have been a catastrophic navigational failure instead put the entire American task force inside the Japanese formation at point-blank range for Japan's massive 14-inch guns. Loaded with bombardment shells meant for an airfield, not armor-piercing rounds meant for warships. Suddenly could not depress low enough or load fast enough to fully exploit their advantage dot. At 1:48 a.m., the Japanese battleship Hiei switched on her searchlight and illuminated the cruiser Atlanta at a range of only 4,500 yards. There was no more room for maneuver, no more room for doctrine, no more room for anything except immediate, close-range violence. The battle that followed lasted barely 24 minutes, and it remains, to this day, one of the most chaotic close-quarters naval engagements ever recorded. What makes this moment so remarkable from a purely tactical standpoint is how completely it inverted the normal relationship between firepower and outcome. Naval gunnery as a science exists to solve a problem of distance, calculating range, bearing, and the time a shell will spend in flight before it reaches a moving target miles away. Every piece of equipment on a 1942 battleship, every rangefinder, every fire control computer, every optical sight was built to solve that problem at ranges of 10,000, 15,000, even 20,000 yards. None of it was built to solve the problem Callaghan's collision course had just created, a problem measured not in miles but in a few hundred yards, where a battleship's main guns physically could not depress low enough to bear on a target running directly alongside her hull, and where identifying friend from enemy in total darkness became almost impossible. Reports from the action would later describe American ships passing so close to Japanese destroyers that lookouts could hear voices and engine sounds distinctly enough to argue, in the heat of the moment, about whether the ship beside them was even hostile. Radio discipline collapsed. Formation cohesion collapsed within minutes. What remained was a swirling, close-range melee that any peacetime naval academy would have called impossible to survive, let alone win. There is no chapter in this story about superior American hardware, because for most of that night, American hardware was outclassed in almost every conventional category that matters. What decided the battle instead was something closer to raw nerve, applied at a range so close that conventional naval gunnery simply stopped functioning the way it was designed to. The destroyer USS Laffey, one of the smallest ships in Callaghan's formation, found herself passing so near the battleship Hiei that her crew could see individual figures moving on the battleship's deck. Laffey opened fire with everything she had, her 5-inch guns and automatic weapons raking Hiei's superstructure at a range measured in dozens of yards rather than thousands, before Hiei's own massive guns, unable to depress far enough to hit a target directly alongside her, fired instead into empty water. Laffey's crew reportedly considered ramming the battleship outright before finally breaking away, badly damaged but still afloat, having inflicted genuine damage on a ship roughly 20 times her size. There is a version of this story where Daniel Callaghan is remembered simply as the admiral who made a navigational error that accidentally worked out. That version misses the point entirely. Callaghan understood, standing on the wrecked bridge of a cruiser that had already taken 50 casualties the day before, exactly what the odds were against his outgunned, hastily assembled task force. His own officers said it aloud. standing beside him in the dark. This is suicide. And Callaghan's answer was not denial, and it was not false confidence. It was simply, yes, I know, but we've got to do it. The plainest possible statement of a man who understood the stakes completely and chose to close the distance anyway, because the airfield behind him could not be allowed to fall. The destroyer O'Bannon found herself in an almost identical position, close enough that HIA's massive guns again passed harmlessly overhead, unable to bear on a target at such close range. O'Bannon returned fire with her 5-inch battery and launched torpedoes directly into the battleship, adding to a mounting toll of hits that, individually small, was beginning to accumulate into something serious. By the time the chaos of that 24 minutes had passed, HIA had absorbed roughly 80 shell hits from the scattered, close-range fire of American cruisers and destroyers that, on paper, had no business inflicting that kind of damage on a battleship at all. Aboard San Francisco, Callaghan's own flagship, the price of leading from the front became brutally clear. A salvo of Japanese 14-inch shells struck the cruiser's bridge directly, killing Callaghan and his entire staff instantly. Command of the ship passed in the chaos to a lieutenant commander who kept San Francisco fighting despite catastrophic damage to her superstructure. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, commanding aboard the light cruiser Atlanta, was killed in the same engagement, making this the only World War II surface battle in which 2 American flag officers died in a single night's fighting. Atlanta herself, crippled early by a torpedo hit and then struck by more than 50 additional shells, including several fired in tragic confusion by other American ships in the chaos of total darkness, was left dead in the water. Even after San Francisco's bridge was destroyed and her admiral killed, the ship kept fighting, and that fact alone tells you something about what this kind of warfare actually demanded of the men aboard it. There was no clean chain of command left to consult, no functioning bridge from which to issue orders in the conventional sense. Officers and enlisted men improvised fire control from secondary stations, passed orders by voice and by runner through smoke-filled passageways, and continued servicing guns that were still, somehow, capable of firing. San Francisco absorbed a staggering total of hits that night, more than a dozen major caliber shells among them, and remained afloat, remained capable of steaming under her own power, and remained, in the most literal sense, still a fighting ship until the guns finally fell silent. The cruiser would later return to Pearl Harbor with her wrecked bridge still visible to every sailor in the fleet, a floating testament to exactly how much punishment the 24 minutes had actually involved. The destroyer Monson suffered a similarly brutal fate, catching fire early in the engagement and eventually having to be abandoned by her crew before exploding entirely around midday. Cushing, hit repeatedly at close range from multiple directions simultaneously, went down burning. And through all of it, ships that had already been reduced to little more than floating wrecks kept their remaining guns in action for as long as there was a gun left to fire and a man left to fire it. That more than any single statistic about shell weight or broadside tonnage is the technical story this battle actually tells. Not which side had the bigger guns. Which side's crews kept fighting after the equation had already turned catastrophically against them. By the time the guns fell silent, the cost on the American side was severe by any measure. The destroyers Cushing, Laffey, Barton, and Monson were sunk. The light cruiser Atlanta was crippled beyond saving. Aboard the light cruiser Juneau, struck by a torpedo that broke her back but left her limping away from the battle, 5 brothers from a single Iowa family, the Sullivan brothers all serving together aboard the same ship, would be lost days later when a Japanese submarine finished what the night battle had started, a loss so devastating to a single American family that it would permanently change United States Navy policy on family members serving together. And yet, measured against what the Japanese force had come to Guadalcanal to accomplish, the night was an unambiguous, campaign-altering defeat for Japan. Admiral Aby's mission had been simple and singular: destroy Henderson Field with a sustained battleship bombardment before dawn. He never got the chance. Callaghan's task force, scattered and bleeding and led by an admiral who did not survive the first 24 minutes of the engagement, had done exactly what it was sent to do. It forced Abe to withdraw his battleships north before he could complete a single organized bombardment run against the airfield. The price Japan paid for that failure compounded quickly. The battleship HIA, crippled by the accumulated close-range fire of that night's fighting and unable to make the retreat north at speed, was caught the following day by American aircraft flying from the very airfield Abe had failed to destroy. She was scuttled by her own crew rather than risk capture. becoming the first Japanese battleship lost in the entire Pacific War. 2 nights later, in a follow-up engagement, American battleships would sink her sister ship Kirishima as well. A convoy of transport ships carrying more than 10,000 Japanese troops, delayed and exposed by the failure of Abe's bombardment mission, was subsequently savaged by American aircraft operating unopposed from Henderson Field, arriving at Guadalcanal a shattered fraction of its intended strength. General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the Marines who depended entirely on that airfield surviving the night, would later write that the greatest homage belonged to Callaghan and Scott and their men, who, in his words, with magnificent courage against seemingly hopeless odds, had driven back the first hostile attack and paved the way for everything that followed. Admiral Abey himself paid a price that had nothing to do with shells or torpedoes. Having failed in his one assigned mission, and having lost a battleship that Japan could not easily replace, he was quietly forced into retirement soon afterward at the age of 53. A career ended not by any single tactical failure in the moment, but by the accumulated verdict of a single impossible night that no amount of superior firepower had been able to overturn. For the wider Japanese war effort in the Solomon Islands, the failure carried consequences that extended far beyond one convoy and one airfield. Guadalcanal would remain in American hands. The airstrip that Abe's battleships had been sent to silence would instead become the launching point for the aircraft that finished off his flagship, sank his sister battleship, and shattered the reinforcement convoy his entire mission had existed to protect. Within weeks, Japanese planners would begin the slow, grinding calculation that eventually led to the evacuation of Guadalcanal entirely. The first time in the Pacific War that Imperial Japan had been forced to abandon ground it had fought to hold, a strategic reversal that traced its roots directly back to 24 minutes of chaos in Ironbottom Sound. He did not survive the battle he led. Neither did Norman Scott nor the 400-plus men who went down with their ships that night in Ironbottom Sound, a stretch of water that earned its name from the sheer number of hulls now resting on its floor. But the mission survived, because for 24 impossible minutes a scattered, outgunned American force fought a battleship fleet at a range where conventional naval warfare simply stopped applying and refused to give the airfield up. Daniel Callaghan was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The USS San Francisco carries his name into naval memory as one of the most decorated ships of the entire war, her superstructure still scarred by the shells that killed him. A physical piece of that bridge preserved today as a memorial in the city that gave the ship her name. The night the United States Navy fought in the dark with their bare hands did not look like victory while it was happening. It looked like exactly what that unnamed officer called it in the seconds before the shooting started. It became a turning point anyway, because the men on those ships had already decided before the first shell ever landed that some airfields are worth defending, even when the mathematics say you cannot win. Ironbottom Sound still holds the wrecks today, dozens of hulls, resting in the dark water between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, a permanent, physical record of exactly how close that night came to going the other way. Every ship down there represents a crew that understood the odds as clearly as Callaghan did on his own bridge and chose to fight anyway. That is the story the mathematics alone can never fully explain. And it is the reason this single chaotic 24-minute engagement is still studied, still remembered, and still more than 80 years later, counted among the most consequential nights in the entire history of the United States Navy.